Hey guys, what's up? All right, we're going to take a look at some of the important stuff from chapter 24. So one of the big things with chapter 24 is all about like the industrial period. And so the rise of industry, the rise of the big city, a few other things. So one of the things we've been talking about a lot, and you can see this picture here, this is essentially what the United States rail network looked like. So after the Civil War, right, railroad production grew. So in 1865, 35,000 miles of railroad track. By 1900, okay, almost 200,000, right? So Congress again assisted with the land grants. Again, we talked a little bit about the credit mobiler scandal. One of the things that we'll see, right, as a result, is the growth of railroad cities. So some of these cities like Tucson, anywhere that the railroads really touch, right, essentially you're going to see a growth of these railroad cities. And so let's take a look at a few other things. So again, the first Continental Railroad, right, was finished in 1862. It was a Union, it was started in 1862. The Union Pacific Railroad in the Central Pacific, right? Again, the credit mobiler scandal. So you had Irish, Chinese, and African Americans who actually built it. In terms of the Central Pacific, right, Leland, Stanford, they eventually met 1869, Promontory Point, Utah. So you can see this picture here of both railroad lines meeting. You eventually had four other major railroads. So there was the Northern Pacific Railroad from Lake Superior to Puget Sound, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, which connected the southwestern deserts, Southern Pacific from New Orleans to San Francisco, and then the Great Northern, so from Duluth, Minnesota to Seattle, Washington. So again, just taking a look at the different ones, right, and how important they were in terms of binding the West to the East Coast. One of the things that's really important too is just some of the innovation and some of the people involved in this all happening. So the older Eastern rails, like the New York Central, for example, were headed by the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. We'll talk a little bit more about him in class. And again, the connection to the West. So some of the things that helped with that was the advancements that were needed. So things like converting from iron to steel, right? The steel being able to withstand a lot more of the weight and actually allowing the trains to travel faster. The Westinghouse air brake, so actually adding an air brake to the trains. The Pullman sleeper cars, so allowing people, George Pullman from Chicago, allowing people to be able to travel on the rails. And then, of course, the telegraph is going to help. And then block signals, so that trains would know when they're supposed to stop and go so that they would avoid crashes. So again, one of the things we talked about was the railroad corruption that was happening. The big one, of course, was the credit mobiler scandal. One of the things that we saw a lot of, too, was the watering of stock. And so what that meant was essentially trying to make it look like the investments, like the company was worth a lot more. One of the things that they used to do with like cows and stuff was that they would actually make the cows drink a lot of water, and it would fatten the cow up. And so what they would do is they would make the cow look like it was worth more, and people would actually pay more when in fact it was simply just water weight. So one of the things that these railroad tycoons used to do was make their company look a lot better, and so then they would inflate sort of the look of the company, and then people would invest heavily. One of the things that they also did to keep politicians quiet and a lot of the companies quiet too from complaining about them was that they used to offer rebates. So in other words, any politician or corporations that were loyal to the railroads, right, they would get cheaper rates because there was no standardized rates. One of the things that also began to happen was the railroads began pulling their money together and their profits together, so they created cartels. So what that meant was they basically got together some of the railroad companies and they were like, hey, instead of competing, why don't we get together, right? I own 25% of the railroad, you own 50% of the railroad, and he owns 25%. So why don't we actually decide that we're going to charge everybody the same rate, and then we will divide up the pooled up profit depending on how much we control. And so that way we ensure ourselves to make some profit, right? And we control the price. So the patrons of husbandry, which were these farmers. The farmers were being taken advantage of left and right by the railroads because they were being given different rates and being charged different things here and there. And so eventually, and we'll talk more about them too when we get to the progressive era. But eventually, some of these farmers, they're going to get together and they're going to create like sort of a union organization called the Patrons of Husbandry. Otherwise known as the Grange, and they began sort of pushing the state legislatures, the state governments, to pass laws protecting them against the railroads. And so these became known as the Granger laws. We will talk about two cases tomorrow involving tomorrow or on Friday with Gold Day. But two cases involving the railroads in the state of Illinois. One is Munn versus Illinois, and then the other one is the Wabash Railroad case, both again in Illinois. As a result of the Wabash case, though, one of the things that's going to happen is Congress is going to pass what is called the Interstate Commerce Act. And basically what it said was when it comes to trade between states, the federal government was going to have the last say. And what they did was they set up the Interstate Commerce Commission to oversee this. The problem with the Interstate Commerce Commission is it's controlled by the government. The government's in bed with big business, and so the interstate commerce ends up being like a shark with no teeth, right? It's not really aggressive. One of the things that we see too is that, again, like we said, 1860, the U.S. is the fourth largest manufacturer in the world. 1894, it becomes number one. We've talked about this, right? Natural resources, immigration. The innovation of the time, right? Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone, Thomas Edison, the light bulb, Nikola Tesla, and the alternating current, AC. And then an English engineer by the name of Henry Bessemer, who began the Bessemer process, which was a faster way of making steel. Another thing that helped during this time too is, again, the government hands-off policy, laissez-faire, and then of course the entrepreneurs. So we will take a look at some of these giants. Some of them will be, of course, in the Men Who Built America. So we're going to focus on Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and then J.P. Morgan. In class, we are going to discuss vertical integration, horizontal integration, and then what an interlocking directorate is. My recommendation, though, is that you take a look at the definitions and see if you can figure them out. But what I want to do in class is we are actually going to take a look in terms of some group stuff, what exactly it is, and then but I would still like you guys to know some definitions. So make sure that you do look up the definitions for all three of those. Vertical integration, though, is connected to Carnegie. Horizontal integration is connected to Rockefeller, and then interlocking directorates is kind of connected to J.P. Morgan. Again, we'll talk about this. English engineer, like I said, Henry Bessemer. He began the Bessemer process, so again was a cheaper and more efficient way. Andrew Carnegie is the guy who opened up the Homestead Steel Company, and I'll tell you a little bit more background about him in class 2. But in Pittsburgh, that's why we have the Pittsburgh Steelers. And so eventually Carnegie decides to sell off the Homestead Steel Company for $400 million to banker J.P. Morgan, who turned it into the United States Steel Corporation, which became the first billion-dollar corporation. One of the things that we'll take a look at, too, is that some of the entrepreneurs actually believe, these captains of industry, that God had essentially made them who they were, and that through God's will, they were essentially made better than everybody else, and so they were destined to do great things, destined to make great money, but one of the things that they should do was take care of society, and so a sort of like uplift, that it was their duty to do that. This became known as the gospel of wealth. And so eventually, like people like Carnegie gave back like 3/4 of his fortunes. And again, many of them began doing a lot of philanthropic work. Many say to make themselves feel better, right? Opening up universities, libraries, whatever it may be. Another thing that came out of this time period too, especially with Darwin's theories, is this idea of social Darwinism. Some of the entrepreneurs, some of the businessmen began arguing that some people, DNA-wise, were meant to be in charge. So they began actually arguing genetics, right? Science, that scientifically some people were meant to be in charge and others were not. Another thing that really helped the corporations during this time is that the Supreme Court actually ruled that the corporations are people. This is actually part of what we're going through right now in 2015, where the Supreme Court just recently ruled the same thing. And essentially they were saying that because the corporations were built by people, that they are themselves representative of people, and so as a result they are protected by the 14th Amendment, so that they deserved equal protection under the law like a human being would. Eventually, the governments are going to begin to go after the so-called trusts. And so one of the things that we'll see is that the trust is just another name for these monopolies. But the government will eventually cave in to some of the pressures that were happening. And so one of the things that we'll see is that the federal government is actually going to pass what is called the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. Again, similar to the Interstate Commerce Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act was supposed to go after these large corporations. But one of the things that we'll see is, as a result, the Sherman Antitrust Act is actually going to be enforced against the unions, and so is the Interstate Commerce Act. But similar to the Interstate Commerce Act, it's going to be like a shark with no teeth. One of the things that we'll see too is the South remain very agrarian, and so part of why is because they already were agrarian, but the North did a lot to kind of keep them in this perpetual state of agrarianism. Northern companies like, so for example, there was a Southern company called Birmingham Steel, and Carnegie essentially told the railroads that if you helped Birmingham Steel transport their steel, that they would lose Carnegie's business, and so they didn't want to lose Carnegie's business, and so many of them stopped doing business with Birmingham Steel, and some of them actually started giving different rates to Birmingham Steel, and as a result, Birmingham Steel will fail. Women were affected by this time period also. So the growth of factory work, many women are going to go out because of necessity. There were all these job opportunities, right? Especially like with telephone, we're going to get what are called hello girls, right? These telephone operators, secretarial work, right? With the typing machine. Fashion is going to be very much dictated by men also. Probably the most famous during this time is the idea of the Gibson girl, which you see in this picture here. It was actually created by a man by the name of Charles Dana Gibson, and it was this idea that women were supposed to be covered up, but it was still, you could see the little waist, the big butt, and the big boobs. It was supposed to make them look voluptuous, but still covering up. When we get to the 1920s, and when we get to the 19th Amendment, the right to vote, we will see many women taking on the fashion ideals of a woman by the name of Coco Chanel from France. And so it was a challenge to the Gibson girl. One of the things that we'll see too is because the government was not taking care of the people, and because the companies were not taking care of the people, because of growth of immigration, the corporations had weapons against the workers, and so one of the things that they would do, right, is they would hire out scabs or replacements. They will do what are called lockouts and yellow dog contracts and blacklisting, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then again, plus the government was not helping, so the workers were forced into having to protect themselves and creating unions. So in 1866, we had what was called the National Labor Union. It had about 600,000 workers. It lasted 6 years until the Panic of 1873. So because of the recession, people were desperate for jobs and weren't necessarily charging to the unions. The economic growth of the Civil War, however, again, like I said, boosted some of the labor needs, but then the panic kills that. The National Labor Union excluded Chinese, blacks, and women because it was a lot more difficult to argue in favor of them. One of the things that they argued in favor of was the 8-hour workday. Eventually, we're also going to get a union that lasted from 1869 to 1881. It was founded by a man named Terence Powderly. They fought for an 8-hour workday. They were very inclusive, including children, women, blacks. And again, they fought against the so-called robber barons. What killed, no pun intended, the Knights of Labor is something that took place in Chicago called the Haymarket Square bombing. So make sure that in your reading you actually take a look at what the Haymarket Square riot was, because I'm going to ask it in class. The union that has lasted until today, that began back then also in 1886, founded by a man named Samuel Gompers, probably one of my favorite names in American history, was the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. And so the part of what made them successful initially is the fact that they only focused on skilled workers. And the reason they did was because, and skilled workers mean also just skilled white workers, because it was a lot easier to fight for their rights because they were much harder to replace. And again, they were the most successful because they are still around today.